When I think of naloxone, I think of a drug that was actually intended to be used by people in an institutional setting, people in an emergency first responder setting, and by anesthesiologists. There is an old acronym that nurses who were just going into practice in a hospital used to be given, and it was LEAN. And it was basically an acronym for 4 emergency drugs that they needed to have handy and needed to know how to use: lidocaine, epinephrine, atropine, and naloxone. And basically, if a nurse had the ability to get their hands on those 4 medications, they could pretty much deal with any emergency they might encounter. So naloxone was stored on crash carts in hospitals. It was stored in many cases in EMT boxes, in the ambulances, and now what we're seeing is the metamorphosis of naloxone busting out of that contained area to become possibly the next AED-like device. When I think about naloxone as being the silver bullet, I think of it as being the silver bullet du jour. I do think that people need to think about naloxone whenever they're prescribing an opioid in 2017. I think that there needs to be some documentation about whether naloxone was considered to be a valuable agent to prescribe, and if it's not, the justification for why it wasn't. I think the biggest challenge with respect to naloxone, in my mind, are the educational hurdles that lay in front of whoever is likely to be given a prescription for naloxone. Because unlike the EpiPen, which is something that people are allergic to bee stings or shellfish or peanuts, is intended to be kept nearby with self-administration. Naloxone is intended to be administered by someone else, not the patient. So that means that the burden of determining an appropriate candidate for administration, determining the fact that naloxone needs to be nearby, needs to be ready to be administered, how a patient is assessed to be an appropriate candidate, all needs to be done by someone who is not the patient. And the question in my mind is, how does that education take place? How does it take place on a wide enough spectrum to enable somebody to administer it in the correct setting at the right time in the right place? It's a big challenge. And I see a variety of different approaches being taken to making it easier for naloxone to get into the hands of people for a community level administration, but I don't see a lot taking place with respect to the education about the administration of the medication and determining when is the right time, let alone what the potential risks are to giving it to someone who is physiologically dependent on an opioid medication. The administration of naloxone could precipitate withdrawal instantaneously. And somebody needs to know how to deal with the consequences of that administration. And lastly, I think another educational challenge is the length of time that an administration of naloxone is likely to last, which could be significantly shorter than the duration of action of the opioid. I hear a lot of discussion about naloxone as being a way to reverse overdoses. We just received a letter from the governor of the state of New York, Governor Cuomo, about the fact that naloxone could be very effective in reversing overdoses. I think people are missing the point. It's very effective in reversing the respiratory depression that's associated with a narcotic overdose. And I think that there's not a lot of dialogue taking place yet. But that being said, a number of organizations are getting fully behind making it easier and easier to get into community-level hands. We will have to see. We'll have to see what happened. When I think about a case like Prince, for example, Prince experienced a respiratory arrest and a quote-unquote overdose in a plane. Naloxone was administered to him. The plane landed. He got to a hospital. The hospital took care of him while he was in the hospital. Presumably, he was on naloxone infusion. And then he checked himself out of the hospital a day and a half later against medical advice and overdosed. Yes, I think that naloxone could be valuable as a component of a broader risk management strategy for one reason and one reason alone. The Food and Drug Administration has recalibrated their determination of risk-benefit analysis for prescription pain medications. Used to be that it was just about determining the risk-benefit analysis for giving the patient a medication, adverse effects related to that, and weighing that to come up with a therapeutic index. That was relatively easy. Now, that's been expanded to what I call the new math, and that needs to include the societal impact of the prescription. And when you think about the societal impact, that could mean that you need to think about when you're writing the opioid prescription that you may bring up naloxone to be kept in the household in the event that somebody in the household gets their hand on that medication and suffers unintended consequences. So it's a component, but it's only a component in the context of a much, much broader initiative. And then there's the whole other story about the substance abusers and how naloxone plays into that story. In terms of decreasing the number of opioid-related deaths, and that would include heroin laced with fentanyl, I think that naloxone has a definite role in that story, but it's a very momentary role and not a long-term role.